The Lesson in the Dark. A story of redemption, survival, and second chances in Detroit. The November wind cut through the empty streets of Corktown like a blade, carrying with it the smell of rust and forgotten industry that had defined Detroit for generations. On Bagley Street, in a modest two-story brick house that had stood since 1923, Thomas Brennan sat in complete darkness, listening to the night. At 68 years old, Tom had learned that darkness was not something to fear. He had spent 28 years in the United States Army, serving 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. He had seen things that most people only encountered in nightmares. He had done things that still visited him in the quiet hours. And he had lost things: friends, innocence, and finally, 3 years ago, his wife Catherine to pancreatic cancer that had hollowed him out like a carved pumpkin left too long on a porch. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling against the cold. Tom preferred it this way. After Catherine died, he had stopped keeping regular hours. The PTSD that had lurked in the shadows of his mind for decades had finally broken free, manifesting in hypervigilance, insomnia, and an inability to sleep in normal conditions. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow concealed an enemy. So Tom had adapted, the way soldiers always adapt. He had converted the basement into a sanctuary. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam, the same material used in recording studios, blocking out the noises that triggered his episode. He had installed a heavy steel door with 3 deadbolts, creating a space where he could finally close his eyes without his hand reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. He slept during the day in that cocoon of silence and prowled his house at night like a ghost haunting his own life. His neighbors thought he was a recluse. The mail carrier assumed he was bedridden. The 3 young men who had been watching his house for the past week believed he was an easy target, a lonely old man with a house full of valuables and no one to protect him. They were wrong. Terribly, fatally wrong. Marcus Williams was 19 years old and already felt ancient. His father had been incarcerated when Marcus was 7, armed robbery, 15 years, and his mother worked double shifts at a nursing home and a hotel, leaving before dawn and returning after midnight. Marcus had raised himself on the streets of Detroit, learning early that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that the only way to survive was to make sure you were never the last. He stood in the alley behind Tom's house, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, studying the property with the calculating eyes of someone who had done this before. The house looked neglected, paint peeling, gutters sagging, a lawn that hadn't been mowed since September. More importantly, he had watched the place for 6 days and never once seen the old man leave or even appear at a window. "Maybe he's dead in there," said Dylan Cooper, 18, standing beside Marcus with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Dylan was thin, jittery, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who had seen too much loss too young. His older brother, Kevin, had died of a fentanyl overdose 2 years ago, and Dylan had been slowly unraveling ever since, numbing his grief with whatever substances he could find. "He ain't dead," Marcus replied. "I seen his lights on at night sometimes. Just for a few minutes, then they go off. Old man probably goes to bed at like 7. The third member of their group was Jalen Torres, 17, the youngest and the most reluctant. Jalen was smart. His teachers had always said so. But smart didn't pay rent when your mother was working 3 jobs and your younger siblings needed food. He had fallen in with Marcus 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of quick money and the illusion of belonging. But standing in that alley, staring at the dark house, something in his gut told him this was a mistake. "I don't know, man," Jalen said quietly. "Something feels off." Marcus turned to him with a look that was equal parts irritation and contempt. "Something always feels off to you. That's called being scared. You want to be scared your whole life, or you want to eat." Jalen had no answer to that. He thought of his 11-year-old sister, Maria, who had asked him yesterday why they never had meat anymore. He thought of his mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from cleaning chemicals. He thought of all the doors that had been closed in his face because of his address, his name, his skin. He stayed. It was 2:47 a.m. when they made their move. Marcus had done his homework. The back door was old, the lock a simple pin tumbler that he could defeat in under a minute. He had learned this skill from his uncle before his uncle had been shot dead in a deal gone wrong. Another lesson from the streets of Detroit. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Tom Brennan had been watching them for 3 days. Tom had spotted them on their second day of surveillance. His bedroom window faced the alley, and while the curtains appeared closed to outside observers, Tom had installed a small gap, invisible from the street, that allowed him to monitor approaches to his property. Old habits died hard. In Fallujah, such vigilance had saved his life more than once. He had watched the 3 young men with a mixture of wariness and something that surprised him. Curiosity. They were young. Children, really, though they carried themselves with the false bravado of men who had seen too much too soon. Tom recognized that posture. He had seen it in young soldiers shipping out for their first deployment, terrified but desperate not to show it. He could have called the police. He probably should have, but something held him back. A sense that these boys were not hardened criminals, but lost souls, standing at a crossroads. And Tom, who had spent so many years taking lives, found himself wondering if he might, just once, be able to save some. So he prepared. The house became a trap, though not the kind that would cause physical harm. Tom was done with violence. He had seen enough of it to last several lifetimes. Instead, he set up a different kind of snare, one designed to contain, to control, and ultimately to teach. He started by reinforcing the weak points. The back door, which Marcus had identified as vulnerable, was fitted with a secondary lock that engaged automatically once the door was opened and closed. The windows on the ground floor were already barred, a remnant of the neighborhood's rougher years, but Tom added magnetic sensors connected to lights in his basement sanctuary. The stairs leading to the second floor were rigged with a pressure plate that would trigger a loud alarm, herding intruders toward the basement rather than up. Tom had learned something important about intruders during his years of service. When faced with unexpected obstacles, most people retreat toward what appears to be safety. He would use that instinct against them. On the night of November 15th, 2024, Tom sat in his basement room, watching the feeds from 3 small cameras he had installed around the property, another precaution from his military days. He saw the 3 figures approach. He saw Marcus work on the lock. He saw them slip inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. And then he began. Marcus was the first to realize something was wrong. The back door had closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. When Dylan tried to open it again to check their escape route, the handle wouldn't budge. A new lock had engaged. One they hadn't seen, one they couldn't pick from the inside. "What the hell?" Dylan whispered, his voice rising with panic. "Shut up," Marcus hissed. "There's got to be another way out. Front door, windows. Just stay calm." But calm was becoming increasingly difficult. The house was darker than any of them had expected. No streetlight penetration, no ambient glow from electronics. It was as if they had stepped into a void. Jalen pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight, and the screen illuminated his face in ghostly blue. "Put that away," Marcus ordered. "You want someone to see us?" "There's no one here to see us," Jalen replied. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The house felt occupied. The air felt watched. They moved through the kitchen, their sneakers quiet on the linoleum. Marcus noticed small details that troubled him. The counters were clean, the sink empty, a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. This was not the house of a dead man or even a neglected one. Someone was living here, actively, carefully. The living room offered no better options. The front door had a deadbolt that required a key from the inside. Unusual, paranoid, deliberate. The windows were barred. The curtains were thick enough to block any light, any signal. "We need to find another exit," Marcus said, his confidence beginning to crack. "There's got to be a basement or something." That was when the alarm went off. The sound was deafening, a military-grade siren that Tom had salvaged from his time at Fort Bragg. It filled the house with a wall of noise, disorienting, overwhelming. The 3 intruders stumbled, hands over their ears, their carefully planned operation dissolving into pure panic. "Go!" Marcus shouted, though he could barely hear his own voice. "Basement! Now!" They ran for the only door that wasn't locked, a heavy wooden door that led down into darkness. It was exactly where Tom wanted them to go. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and in their haste, Dylan tripped and tumbled down the last 5 steps, landing hard on the concrete floor. Marcus and Jalen followed, and the moment they cleared the doorway, the door swung shut behind them with a pneumatic hiss. The siren stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. For a long moment, none of them moved. They stood in absolute darkness, breathing hard, their hearts pounding against their ribs. Dylan groaned from the floor, clutching his ankle. Jalen fumbled for his phone again, and this time Marcus didn't stop him. The pale light revealed a basement that defied their expectations. It was not cluttered with junk or storage boxes. Instead, It was meticulously organized, shelves lined with supplies, a workbench with tools arranged by size, and in the corner, a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged in a bank vault. "What is this place?" Jalen whispered. The answer came from the darkness beyond the steel door. "This is where I live." The door swung open, and Thomas Brennan stepped into the light. He was not what they expected. They had imagined a frail old man, stooped and vulnerable. Instead, they saw someone who carried his years like armor. Tom was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture straight despite his age. His hair was gray, but his eyes were sharp, alert, assessing them with a calm that was more terrifying than any anger could have been. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, his feet bare on the cold concrete. In his hand, he held not a weapon, but a cup of coffee, steam rising in the chill air. "Sit down," Tom said. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority, the voice of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat, who had made life-and-death decisions under fire. "All of you, against that wall. Now." Marcus thought about running. He thought about fighting. But something in Tom's eyes stopped him, a look that said very clearly that any attempt would end badly. Marcus had seen violence before, had even participated in it, but he had never encountered someone who radiated such complete certainty. This man had killed people, many people, and he had done it so often that it no longer troubled him. They sat. Tom pulled up a chair, an old wooden thing that creaked under his weight, and positioned himself between them and the stairs. He took a long sip of his coffee, studying each of them in turn. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to stay here for a while. The door behind me is locked with a code that changes every 6 hours. The walls are soundproof. You could scream for a week and no one would hear you. Your phones don't work down here." He let that sink in, watching the fear bloom on their faces. "Now, I could call the police. Breaking and entering, attempted robbery. You'd each get a few years, especially you." He pointed at Marcus. "I'm guessing this isn't your first offense. Am I right?" Marcus said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "The thing is," Tom continued, "I don't think prison would fix whatever's broken in you. I've seen prisons, military ones, foreign ones you don't even want to know about. They don't rehabilitate anyone. They just make broken." He stood and walked to his workbench, setting down his coffee cup on a coaster, a small gesture of domestic normalcy that somehow made the whole scene more surreal. "So instead, we're going to talk. You're going to tell me who you are, why you're here, and what you think you're doing with your lives. And I'm going to tell you some things too, things I've never told anyone." And by the end, Jalen was the first to speak. "You can't keep us here. That's kidnapping." Tom's laugh was short and humorless. "Son, you broke into my house at 3 a.m. Anything that happens to you now is self-defense. But here's the thing. I'm not going to hurt you." He smiled, and the smile held no warmth. "I'm going to make you think." The first hour was silence. Tom had returned to his room, leaving the steel door open, a gesture of trust or perhaps a test. The three young men sat against the wall, afraid to move, afraid to speak, their eyes darting between the open door and the stairs that led to freedom, but were sealed by locks. They couldn't defeat. Marcus was calculating. He was always calculating distances, angles, odds. The old man was strong, but he was 68. 3 against 1. If they timed it right, if they rushed him together. But something stopped him. It wasn't just the military bearing or the calm confidence. It was something in the old man's eyes when he'd looked at them. Not anger, not hatred, but something that looked almost like recognition. Like he knew them, like he had been them once, a long time ago. Dylan was shaking. The withdrawal was starting. He hadn't used in almost 18 hours, and his body was beginning to protest. His skin was clammy, his stomach churning. He thought about the pills in his jacket pocket, the ones that would make everything feel okay again, but he was afraid to move. Jalen was thinking about his sister. Maria would be waking up in a few hours, getting ready for school. She would find the $20 he'd left on the kitchen counter, money he'd earned doing odd jobs, not from anything illegal, and she would use it to buy lunch for herself and maybe something extra for their mother. She trusted him. She believed he was better than this. Maybe she was wrong. Tom returned, carrying a tray with 4 cups of coffee and a plate of toast. He set it down on a small table and gestured for them to take some. "You're probably hungry," he said. "I know I always was, at your age. Never enough food, never enough of anything." No one moved. Tom shrugged and took a cup for himself. "I'm going to tell you a story now. You can listen or not. That's up to you. But I think you'll want to hear it, because it's about how a boy from a neighborhood just like yours ended up sitting in this basement, waiting for 3 idiots to break into his house." He sat down again, cradling the coffee cup in hands that bore the scars of old burns and older fights. "I grew up in Flint," he began. "This was the 70s, before the water crisis, before the world knew or cared about what was happening there. My father worked at the GM plant until the layoffs started. Then he worked wherever he could. Odd job." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I was headed the same way. I'd been arrested twice by the time I was 17. Petty theft, just like you. Nothing serious, but enough to put me on a path. And then one night, I broke into a house." He looked at them, making sure they understood. "It was an old house, just like this one. I thought the owner was out of town. I was wrong. He was a Vietnam veteran named Harold Washington. Black man. 60 years old. Had been through things that made my little..." Tom's smile was sad, distant. "He could have shot me. He could have called the cops. Instead, he sat me down and talked to me for 6 hours. He told me about the war, about the friends he'd lost, about the life he'd built after coming home to a country that did..." "What did you do?" Jalen asked, surprising himself. "I joined the Army the next week. Harold drove me to the recruiting station himself, signed me up, shook my hand, and told me to make something of myself." Tom's voice grew thick. "He died 8 years later. Heart attack. I was in Kuwait when I got the news. Couldn't even make it to the funeral. But everything I am, everything I am, everything I've done, good and bad, started in that man's living room. He looked at each of them in turn. So now it's your turn. Tell me your stories. And don't lie. I've interrogated people a lot scarier than you, and I can always tell. Marcus went first, reluctantly, his words coming out in short, angry bursts. He told them about his father, a man he barely remembered who had written him letters from prison that eventually stopped coming. He told them about his mother, who worked so hard she had become a ghost, a presence he sensed but rarely saw. He told them about the first time he'd stolen something, a candy bar from a corner store when he was 9, his stomach growling, his pride too great to ask for help. I'm not looking for sympathy, Marcus said at the end, his jaw set. I know what I am. I know what I do. But the world made me this way. Don't act like I had some choice that I turned down. Tom nodded slowly. You're right. The world isn't fair. It never has been, and it probably never will be. But here's what I learned in the army. The world gives you a hand of cards, and you don't get to choose them. What you do get to choose is how you play them. He leaned forward. You're smart, Marcus. I can see it in your eyes. You're always thinking, always calculating. That's a gift. But right now, you're using it to figure out how to take from people. What if you used it to figure out how to build something instead? Build what? Marcus scoffed. I got no money, no connections, no degree. Nobody's going to hire me for anything legit. That's what I thought too, Tom said. And then Harold told me something that changed my life, he said. The army doesn't care where you come from. They only care what you're willing to become. And you know what? He was right. I went in as a scared kid. He stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down a small metal box. Inside were photographs, medals, documents, the artifacts of a life. I'm not saying the military is the answer for everyone. It's not. But there are other paths, trade schools, apprenticeships, programs for young men exactly like you, designed by people who understand what you're going through. He handed Marcus a business card from the box. This is the number for a veterans organization in Detroit that does job training. I volunteer there sometimes, when I can make myself leave this house. They've helped hundreds of young men find work, real work, with benefits and future. Marcus looked at the card like it might bite him. Why do you care? Because Harold cared about me, and because I'm tired of watching young men throw their lives away for a few $100s. You broke into my house tonight for what? A TV, some electronics. Dylan's story came next, pulled out of him like splinters from a wound. He talked about Kevin, his older brother, his hero, the person who had protected him when their parents' marriage had exploded into violence and divorce. Kevin had been strong, funny, the kind of person who lit up a room. And then he'd gotten injured at work, and the doctors had prescribed painkillers, and somewhere between the first pill and the last, Kevin had become someone else entirely. I found him, Dylan said, his voice barely a whisper. In his apartment, he'd been dead for 2 days. The needle was still in his arm. Tom listened without interruption, his face grave. I started using after that, Dylan continued. Just to not feel anything. Just to make it stop. And now I can't stop, even when I want to, even when I know it's killing me, just like it killed him. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to Dylan, kneeling down so they were at eye level. I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone, Tom said. When I came back from my third tour in Iraq, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop seeing the faces of people I'd killed. So I started drinking. At first, it was just a few beers to take the edge off. Then his voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. Catherine, my wife, she found me one night in the garage with a gun. I don't remember putting it there, but she said I was crying and apologizing to people who weren't there. She took the gun away and held me until the sun came up, and then she drove me. He put a hand on Dylan's shoulder. I was in treatment for 6 months. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than any combat, harder than any mission. But I got clean, and I stayed clean for 15 years. It's possible. From his pocket, Tom produced another card, this one for a rehabilitation center. This place saved my life. They have programs for people without insurance, without money. They'll take you tonight if you want. All you have to do is say yes. Dylan stared at the card, tears streaming down his face. What if I can't do it? What if I'm not strong enough? Then you try again, and again, and again. That's what being strong means. Not never falling, but always getting back up. Jalen's story was the shortest, but somehow the most painful. He talked about his mother, a woman who had come to this country from Honduras with nothing, who had worked her way through night school while raising 3 children alone, who had instilled in him a love of learning and a belief that education was the path to a better life. I was supposed to be different, Jalen said, staring at his hands. I got good grades. I was going to go to college, get a degree, get a real job. But then my mom got sick, and the bills started piling up, and my little sister needed things, and I just... He trailed off. You did what you thought you had to do, Tom finished. You made a choice to protect your family, even if it meant sacrificing yourself. Jalen nodded miserably. I tell myself it's temporary, just until things get better. But things don't get better, and every time I do something like this, I feel like I'm losing a piece of who I used to be. Tom sat back in his chair, studying the youngest of the 3 with something that looked almost like respect. You know what the difference is between you and me? When I was your age, you still feel it. The guilt, the shame, the sense that you're betraying something important. I had lost that by the time I was 17. I didn't care about anything anymore. He stood and paced the room slowly. That conscience you have, that voice telling you this is wrong, that's the most valuable thing you own, more valuable than any money you could steal from this house, because as long as you can still hear it, you can still turn back. He picked up Jalen's phone from where it had fallen during the chaos earlier. Your mother, what's her name? Elena. De Dogian. Wa Tundeki chapter 10 Shetia. Tom nodded. I'm going to give you a choice, Jalen. In a few hours, I'm going to let you all go. No police, no charges. But you need to decide what you're going to do when you walk out that door. You can go back to... He handed the phone back. The choice is yours, but I'm going to tell you something that Harold told me all those years ago. The decisions you make when no one is watching are the ones that define who you really are. The hours passed slowly in that basement, but something shifted as they did. The fear that had marked the early part of the night began to fade, replaced by something else, something that felt almost like connection. Tom told them more stories from his military career. He told them about the young Iraqi translator who had saved his life during an ambush and who had been killed by insurgents a week later for helping Americans. He told them about the Afghan village elder who had invited Tom's unit to share a meal, teaching them that hospitality could exist even in the middle of war. He told them about the letters he still received from the families of soldiers who had served under him, some grateful, some angry, all of them a reminder that his choices had shaped lives beyond his own. And he taught them practical things too, the kind of knowledge that an old soldier accumulates over a lifetime. You want to stay safe in a house by yourself? Tom said at one point, gesturing around the basement. First thing, always have multiple layers of security. Locks on your doors are good, but they're not enough. You need motion sensors, cameras, a way to know when someone's approaching before they get to you. He showed them the small monitor that displayed feeds from his cameras. Second, create a safe room. Doesn't have to be fancy, just a space where you can retreat if things go bad. Reinforce the door. Stock it with supplies. Make sure you can communicate with the outside world. Marcus was paying attention now, his earlier hostility fading into genuine interest. Third, Tom continued, know your neighbors. I know I'm a hypocrite saying this. I've barely talked to anyone on this street in 3 years. But if I'd been more connected to my community, I might have known about you 3 before. He looked at each of them. And fourth, trust your instincts. Jalen, you said something felt off tonight. You were right. If you'd listened to that feeling, you wouldn't be sitting here now. Your gut knows things. Your brain doesn't. Learn to listen to it. Dylan raised his hand hesitantly, like a student in class. What about the other stuff? The things you did to trap us? Tom smiled slightly. You mean the automatic lock on the back door? The pressure plate on the stairs? Those are advanced measures, overkill for most situations. But the principle is the same. Always have a plan. When you control the terrain, you control the outcome. He paused, his expression growing serious. But let me tell you something about being the one who sets traps. It changes you. Every precaution you take, every barrier you build, it separates you a little more from the world. I've spent the last 3 years. He looked at them with something that might have been shame. I caught you tonight because I'm paranoid, not because I'm wise. Don't become like me. It was nearly 7 a.m. when Tom finally entered the code to unlock the basement door. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the small windows at ground level, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The 3 young men stood uncertainly, their bodies exhausted, but their minds strangely alert. The back door is unlocked now, Tom said. You can leave whenever you're ready. Nobody moved. Marcus was the first to speak. Why didn't you just call the cops? Why go through all this? Tom considered the question for a long moment. Because Harold didn't call the cops on me. And because I've spent my whole life since then wondering what I could do with the second chance he gave me. I've saved lives and I've taken lives. And at the end of it all, I'm not sure which side of the ledger has more entry. He walked to the stairs and sat down on the bottom step, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. I'm tired, boys. Tired of being alone. Tired of being afraid. Tired of watching young men walk paths I know lead nowhere good. If talking to you all night means even one of you makes a different choice, then maybe I've done something worth doing. Jalen stepped forward first. He extended his hand, and after a moment of surprise, Tom shook it. Thank you, Jalen said. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I heard you. I heard everything you said. Dylan was next, his handshake trembling, but firm. That card you gave me, the rehab place, would you take me there? I don't think I can go alone. Tom's eyes widened slightly, and something softened in his face. Yeah, I can do that. Let me get my keys. Marcus hung back, his face unreadable. When the others had gone upstairs, he approached Tom slowly. I don't know if I believe everything you said, he admitted, about second chances and choices and all that. The world's been pretty clear about what it thinks of people like me. The world is wrong a lot of the time, Tom replied. Maybe. Marcus pulled out the business card Tom had given him earlier. The one for the Veterans Job Training Program. I'm not making any promises, but I'll make a call. See what they have to say. Oh, Tom nodded. That's all I ask. Just make the call. At the back door, Marcus paused and looked back at the old soldier. You know, for a crazy old man living alone with a bunch of traps in his house, you're not so bad. Tom almost smiled. For a wannabe burglar with no skill at picking locks, neither are you. The morning sun was fully up by the time Tom's truck pulled out of the driveway with Dylan in the passenger seat. Jalen had called his mother, his voice breaking as he explained that he'd been out all night, that he was safe, that he was coming home. Marcus had disappeared into the streets, but the business card had gone with him. Tom drove in silence, unused to having company in his vehicle. Dylan stared out the window at the passing streets, his face pale and drawn. I'm scared, Dylan said quietly, of going to that place, of what happens next. That's okay, Tom replied. Being scared means you understand what's at stake. The ones who aren't scared are the ones who don't make it. They drove past a diner, and Tom suddenly pulled into the parking lot. What are we doing? Dylan asked. Getting breakfast. Tom turned off the engine. You're going to be in treatment for a while. Might as well have a real meal first. Inside, they sat in a booth by the window. Tom ordered coffee and eggs. Dylan asked for pancakes, the first real food he'd wanted in days. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Darlene, according to her name tag, brought their drinks and gave Tom a curious look. Haven't seen you in here before, she said. You new to the neighborhood? Been here 30 years, Tom admitted. Just don't get out much. Darlene smiled. Well, you're welcome anytime. We could use more regulars. After she left, Dylan looked at Tom with something like wonder. You just talked to her like it was nothing. Nothing. Just being human. Tom took a sip of his coffee. That's the real lesson, Dylan. Not the traps in the basement or the cameras or the safe room. The real lesson is that you can't survive alone. Nobody can. We need each other. Even cranky old soldiers who've forgotten how to live. The pancakes arrived, golden and fragrant, and Dylan ate like he hadn't seen food in weeks. Tom watched him, remembering 100 young soldiers he'd fed over the years, remembering the simple truth that a meal shared was a bridge built. Can I tell you something? Dylan asked between bites. Go ahead. When we broke into your house, I was hoping something would happen. Not something good, just something. Something that would change things, one way or another. I didn't care if it was prison or death or whatever. Tom nodded slowly. I know that feeling. Felt it myself, more times than I can count. Is it always going to feel like this? Like nothing matters? No. Tom's voice was firm. It won't, but you have to do the work. You have to show up day after day, even when it feels pointless. And eventually, you'll wake up one morning and realize that somewhere along the way, things got better. Not perfect, never perfect. He reached across the table and put a hand on Dylan's shoulder. I'll visit you if they allow it. And when you get out, if you need a place to stay while you get on your feet, I have a spare room. It's been empty for 3 years. Might be time someone used it. Dylan's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me. Tom thought of Harold Washington, dead now for 41 years, whose single act of mercy had echoed through decades. He thought of Catherine, who had seen something worth saving in a broken soldier. He thought of all the chances he had been given, and all the chances he had failed to give others. But someone did it for me once, he said. And because maybe that's what we're here for, to catch each other when we fall. 6 months later, on a warm May evening, Thomas Brennan hosted his first dinner party in 30 years. The guests were an unlikely group. Marcus, who had completed the job training program and was now apprenticing as an electrician. Dylan, 90 days, clean and living in Tom's spare room. They sat around Tom's dining room table, a table that had been buried under newspapers and dust until a week ago, when Dylan had insisted on cleaning the house top to bottom as a way to repay Tom's kindness. The meal was simple but abundant. Rice and beans, roasted chicken, a salad from the garden that Alina had helped Tom start in his backyard. This is good, Marcus said, his mouth full. Like really good. Alina's recipe, Tom said. She's been teaching me. Turns out, I'm not as hopeless in the kitchen as I thought. Jalen laughed. Mom's been trying to teach me for years. I still can't make rice without burning it. That's because you don't pay attention, Elena chided gently. Cooking is like life. You have to be present. You have to watch and listen and adjust. She looked around the table at the unlikely family that had formed in her son's wake. I still don't understand everything that happened that night, she said. Jalen has told me some of it, but I think there's more he's not saying. There is, Jalen admitted. What matters is what happened after. Mr. Brennan gave us a chance, Mom. He didn't have to, but he did. Tom shook his head. I didn't give you anything. I just showed you a door. You're the ones who walked through it. Dylan raised his glass of sparkling water. To doors, he said. And to the people who show us where they are. They drank. The evening light streamed through windows that had been dark for so long, illuminating faces that had been strangers 6 months ago and were now something more. Not quite family, perhaps, but something in that direction, something worth fighting for. After dinner, Tom and Marcus sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors calling to each other. Sounds that Tom had shut out for years, but was slowly learning to hear again. You know, Marcus said, I used to think people like you, old guys with houses and pensions and whatever, I used to think you were the enemy, like you'd gotten everything you had by taking it from people like me. Tom didn't respond, just listened. But now I think maybe it's more complicated than that. Maybe everybody's just trying to survive in their own way. And maybe the real enemy is whatever keeps us from seeing each other as people. Tom nodded slowly. That's a pretty wise observation for a 20-year-old. I'm 19, Marcus corrected. And I learned it from a 68-year-old man who locked me in his basement. They both laughed, a sound that echoed across the backyard and into the gathering dusk. What's next for you? Tom asked. Finish the apprenticeship, get my license, maybe start my own business someday. Marcus paused. And maybe try to find my dad. He's getting out next year, after 18 years. I don't know what to say to him, but I think I need to try. That's brave. That's terrifying, Marcus corrected. But you taught me something that night in the basement. You said the decisions you make when no one is watching are the ones that define who you really are. Well, no one would know if I just let him rot. No one would blame me. But no. Tom felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been tight for a very long time. Harold would have liked you, he said. The man who saved me. He would have seen what I see. Someone worth betting on. Marcus stood, stretching. I should get going. Early shift tomorrow. You need a ride? Nah, I'll walk. It's a nice night. He started toward the gate, then turned back. Hey, Mr. Brennan. Tom. Call me Tom. Bunny. Marcus smiled. Thank you for everything. Thank you, Tom replied, for reminding me what all this was supposed to be for. Marcus nodded once, then disappeared into the night. Tom sat on the porch for a long time after, watching the stars emerge one by one, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Far away, in a rehabilitation center in Ann Arbor, Dylan was writing a letter to his dead brother. He would never send it, of course. But the counselors said it might help to put words to the things he'd never been able to say. Dear Kevin, he wrote, I met someone who understands. Not everything, but enough. He told me that getting clean isn't about being strong. It's about being stubborn, about showing up again and again, even when you fall. I think I understand now why you couldn't do that. The world was too heavy, and nobody showed you the door. But someone showed me, Kev, and I'm going to walk through it. for both of us. He set down the pen and looked out the window at the Michigan night. Somewhere out there, a scared old soldier was learning to live again. Somewhere, a young man was teaching himself to build instead of take. Somewhere, a mother was holding her son and thanking God for second chances. And somewhere, in the darkness between the stars, the ghosts of the past were finally beginning to rest. The night that three young men broke into Thomas Brennan's house became a story told in the neighborhood for years afterward. A story that grew and changed with each telling, acquiring the weight of legend. Some said the old soldier had fought them off with his bare hands. Others said he had held them at gunpoint for hours. A few claimed he had simply talked to them, though that version seemed too strange to believe. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any of the legends. The truth was that one night in a basement in Detroit, four broken people had found each other. They had shared their pain and their hope, their failures and their dreams. And in doing so, they had discovered something that all of them had forgotten, that no one is beyond redemption, and no darkness is so deep that light cannot reach it. Tom still lived in his house on Bagley Street, but the basement was no longer his prison. He slept upstairs now, in the bedroom he had shared with Catherine. And though the nightmares still came sometimes, they came less often. He had started volunteering again at the Veterans Center, and once a week he hosted a support group for elderly residents who lived alone, teaching them the practical skills he had learned, but more importantly, teaching them that isolation was a choice, not a sentence. The locks on his doors remained, and the cameras still watched. But the steel door to the basement stood open now, and the soundproof room had been converted into a workshop where he taught woodworking to young men from the neighborhood, skills that could become jobs that could become cute. On the wall of that workshop hung a single photograph, a young black man in Vietnam-era military uniform, his smile bright against the backdrop of war. Harold Washington, 1943 to 1983. Below it, Tom had written a single line. The decisions you make when no one is watching are the ones that define who you really are. And every day, young men passed by that photograph and wondered about its story. And every day, Tom was there to tell them. Because that is how mercy spreads, not in grand gestures, but in small moments of grace, passed from one broken soul to another, across years and miles, and all the walls we build to keep each other out. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person who breaks into your house becomes the person who helps you break out of your own. The end. Summary of practical tips from the story. Helpful tips for home security. What Tom taught. Install multiple layers of security. Locks alone aren't enough. Add motion sensors, cameras, and alert systems that warn you before intruders reach your door. Create a safe room. Designate a reinforced space in your home where you can retreat if threatened. Stock it with communication devices, basic supplies, and ensure the door is solid. And know your terrain. Understand every corner of your home. In darkness or emergency, this knowledge becomes your greatest advantage. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't dismiss gut feelings. They often detect threats before your conscious mind does. Build community connections. The best security system is neighbors who watch out for each other. Isolation makes you vulnerable. Community makes you strong. We have a communication plan. Ensure you can contact emergency services from your safe space. Keep a charged phone or backup communication device ready. Control access points. Know all entry points to your home and reinforce the weakest ones. A door is only as strong as its frame and hinges. Things to avoid. Mistakes the young men made. Never assume a house is empty just because you don't see activity. Some people keep irregular hours or have reasons to stay hidden. Never ignore warning feelings. Jalen's instinct told him something was wrong. Ignoring it led to their capture. He don't rely on a single observation period. 6 days wasn't enough to understand Tom's true patterns. Never underestimate older people. Age doesn't equal weakness. Life experience often means more skills, not fewer. You don't let desperation override judgment. All three made choices driven by immediate need rather than long-term thinking. Never enter unfamiliar territory without an exit plan. Once inside Tom's house, they had no contingency for unexpected obstacles. Don't mistake silence for absence. A quiet house may contain someone who has learned to be very, very still. Warnings about isolation and mental health. Isolation is not protection. It's a different kind of danger. Tom survived physically, but nearly died emotionally by cutting himself off from the world. PTSD and trauma require professional help, not just coping mechanisms. Tom's basement sanctuary helped him sleep, but didn't address the underlying wounds. Addiction thrives in isolation. Dylan's substance use worsened because he had no support system to help him process his grief. The things we build to keep others out often become prisons that keep us trapped. Security measures should protect life, not replace it. Lessons about second chances. Everyone deserves the opportunity to change, but change requires action, not just intention. The person who helps you might be the last person you expect. Sometimes grace comes from strangers. Mentorship creates ripples across generations. Harold saved Tom, who saved 3 young men, who will someday save others. Redemption is not a single moment, but a daily choice. Marcus, Dylan, and Jalen must choose their new paths every day. The measure of a life is not what you've done, but what you do with what you've learned.